For the same reason, I also believed that evil is a kind of material substance with its own foul and misshapen mass, either solid, which they used to call earth, or thin and subtle as the body of air. They imagine it to be a malignant mind creeping through the earth, and since piety, however bizarre some of my beliefs were, forbade me to believe that the good God had created an evil nature, I concluded that there were two opposing masses, both infinite, but the evil rather smaller and the good rather larger, and of this pestilential beginning, other blasphemous notions were the corollary. When my mind attempted to return to the Catholic faith, it was rebuffed, because the Catholic faith is not what I thought. My God, to whom your mercies make it possible for me to make a confession, I felt it more reverent to believe you infinite in all respects but one, namely the mass of evil opposed to you, than to think that you in all parts limited to the shape of the human body. I thought it better to believe that you had created no evil, in which my ignorance, I thought, not merely some sort of substance but even corporeal, since I did not know how to think of mind except as a subtle physical entity diffused through space, rather than to believe that the nature of evil, as I understood it, came from you. Our Savior himself, your only Son, I imagined emerging from the mass of your dazzling body of light for our salvation. I could believe in him only what my vain imagination could picture. I thought a nature such as his could not be born of the Virgin Mary without being mingled with flesh. That he could be mixed with us and not polluted, I did not see, because my mental picture was what it was. I was afraid to believe him incarnate, lest I had to believe him to be defiled by the flesh. Today, your spiritual believers will kindly and lovingly laugh at me when they read these my confessions. Nevertheless, that was my state of mind. Augustine's professional life in Carthage, on to Rome, and then on to Milan is marked by a central question that Augustine is searching, which is the question of what is true. That might seem obvious from most of what Augustine is written so far, but this particular question of what is true is a particularly important question for us to have as theme for this chapter specifically. Augustine, again, last chapter, begins to examine his philosophy. What exactly does he believe about the world? And this is where he begins to be associated with the Manichaeans. And because of the way that the Manichaeans were able to describe the world, Augustine found truth in that. And the truth that Augustine found in that, always truth is mediated by various means. And even the best conceived notion of the world has truth kernels within it, but also can have some large issues or large problems with its worldview. This is what Augustine begins to wrestle with in this chapter. The search for truth is going to lead Augustine down a couple of paths. Number one, is truth merely rhetorical or objective? Now, in this chapter, Augustine goes over and over again how he was not interested in the substance of what someone was talking about. He was interested in the way in which they said it. This is a particular sort of thing for Augustine, and likewise for other of higher class within Augustine's time period. Rhetoric and the art of teaching rhetoric was not about speaking truth. It was about speaking well, no matter what you're speaking out of your mouth. In fact, Augustine's previous career as a rhetorician, now that he's writing after the fact as a bishop of the church, Augustine's prior career as a rhetorician was actually a deeply suspicious activity for the people of the church at the time. Because rhetoricians were known for being able to convince their audience of anything as long as they were able to say it well. In classical rhetoric, there are three particular parts of the rhetorical exercise. One is the logos, what is being said, or the substance of what's being said. Two is the pathos, what emotions are we evoking in what is being said. and the ethos. How are we presenting ourselves? And how exactly are we connecting with the audience? So ethos, pathos, and logos, all of these things are meant to carry a particular kind of weight whenever we are giving some sort of speech or something like that. But sometimes the pathos and ethos can trump the logos, so to speak. The substance of what's being said can be, in this particular model, shortchanged for the ethos and the pathos, such that you can simply convince people of whatever you want to if you can say it well. This is, again, one of the words that Augustine uses that seems weird to us, but Augustine will say the word loquacious a couple of times within the past couple of chapters. They're talking about rhetorical speakers as being loquacious. And that word, we don't really have a good way of translating that word in a simple way, but loquacious, or the propensity to be loquacious, is basically you sound wonderful, but you have no substance in you. It's the car salesman, basically. The car salesman who's selling you, now I should say, the underhanded car salesman. There are plenty of good salesmen out there, but the car salesman who is attempting to sell you whatever is on the lot right now, even if what's on the lot is worthless. The substance of what that car salesman is trying to give you is worth nothing, but the way that they are saying it, the way that they are trying to pathologically connect with you and present themselves in their ethos, they are trying to convince you of a certain action by their rhetorical skill, not by the actual substance of their argument. So Augustine struggles with that, not simply on his part, but also on the fact that this is a temptation in whatever sort of endeavor that Augustine put his mind to. He was, he was concerned, and this is in his retrospective look at himself, he was concerned, even at an early age, with not simply saying things well, but saying things true. And this comes to a head whenever the Manichaean philosopher Faustus comes to speak to Augustine's cohort of Manichaeans. And Augustine had been, again, he's heard many things about Faustus and looks forward to meeting Faustus. But notice why. Augustine breaks a little bit with the expectations of the reader, because he knows that Faustus is a good speaker. But Augustine is more interested in Faustus clarifying his doubts about certain problems within the Manichaean philosophy. And it all revolves around the problem that Augustine is running into of flesh versus spirit. In the Manichaean philosophy, just as a reminder, flesh is bad, physical is bad, spiritual, and in the Manichaean philosophy, spiritual is non-physical. Non-physical is good. Everything that is physical is evil. Everything that is spiritual is good. And spiritual meaning non-physical. In that sense, everything that is physical is a jail cell for the spiritual. And what the Manichaean philosophy is saying is that it is the job of those who are elect, those who are heroes, those who are enlightened, to change the physical into the spiritual, or to set free the spirits that are imprisoned by these physical realities. Such that, as we said in earlier chapters, the act of eating in the Manichaean philosophy is actually an act of freeing imprisoned spirits. You are taking physical food into yourself, and you are freeing the spirits that are within these trapped physical objects. Well, perhaps you can see why this became an issue for Augustine. Because when we talk about ourselves, the human condition, when we talk about humans, how exactly are we to know whether what we are perceiving is true, or whether what we are looking at in the world is simply false? To use a kind of rudimentary example, Augustine is concerned that when we are looking at the world, when we are perceiving things in the world, objects around, the books behind me, the desk beside me, the camera in front of me, am I perceiving the truth about the world, or am I only being deceived by all of these objects that are evil in nature? What Augustine then runs into is that evil, in his conception in Manichaeism, is a physical objective reality. Evil, a manifestation of evil, is physicality. And if physicality is a manifestation of evil, Augustine then runs into the problem of physical reality being conduits of things that seem to be goods. The good thing about existence, and likewise for Augustine, aesthetic beauty. Augustine is struggling with this concept of if physicality is merely evil, then how is it that goods seem to flow from these particular things? Is it because of the spiritual reality within these things that are breaking through the physical imprisonment of these things? But then again, as Augustine would say, we run into a problem, because if the physical reality is indeed evil, then what exactly do we say about the mind? Different conceptions from the ancient world say that the mind is a physical reality diffused over long distances. This is the reference that you heard in the first part of the reading opening up this chapter. And as Augustine is struggling with this conception, it is, again, I think Augustine is noticing that there is a contradiction between some of the conceptions of what the mind is and what the conceptions of physicality is. And so Augustine wants to have some clarification from Faustus. What he finds, though, is something that I think is really interesting, which is that Augustine really likes Faustus. He really likes him for a specific reason, and I hope you caught this. Faustus admits when he doesn't know something. And in fact, Faustus develops somewhat of a relationship with Augustine while he resides with the Manichaeans during Augustine's time and tenure as a rhetorician. And this is before Augustine's move to Rome. But Faustus is actually someone who Augustine really likes, because he's very humble in his assumptions. Augustine says that while I lost, this is a great line, by the way, in the early part of this chapter, while I really liked Faustus, Augustine says, I began to lose confidence in Manichaeism because of an important point, which is that Faustus was not able to explain the logos issue of Manichaeism. But Faustus's ethos and pathos was something that Augustine deeply connected with. And again, ethos and pathos is not merely used to get rid of the logos, but ethos and pathos are real things. Emotional connection is a real thing. And ethos and pathos is like tools in the tool belt. They can be used for good or for bad purposes. And Faustus, for all of the things which Faustus might be incorrect about when it comes to the logos, when it comes to the actual belief system, Faustus had, at least what it seems to be, a fairly decent person. Fairly realistic person, a fairly humble person when it comes to the limitations of what they can explain. And Augustine really, really latches onto this. And even in his prayer to God, even mentions that God was using Faustus in an interesting way to, in one way, lead Augustine away from Manichaeism. Again, the logos was not working. But also to, in his friendship with Faustus, to highlight that there's something beyond Manichaeism, and it was okay for that to be the case. Again, Faustus's humility in not jumping to a conclusion and not trying to say something that's untrue was a way that Augustine actually took as a lesson in humility, and basically said, you know what, maybe there is something beyond Manichaeism that I need to think about. Hence why he can say with full confidence that he, at that point after meeting Faustus, decided he was not going to continue in Manichaeism. But then again, Manichaeism was the best thing he had at the time. And so he was, as he said, content to simply maintain the course, to simply stay where he was. He didn't have any reason to do otherwise. This is when he makes the decision to move to Rome. Unfortunately, causing some family turmoil because this really upset Monica, his mom. And the move to Rome is one that brings a lot of interesting change for Augustine. One thing is, I really enjoyed his discussion over the difference between the students that he taught in Carthage versus the students he taught in Rome and in Milan. And sort of the perspective on students' troublemaking and the differences between different cultures and things like that. But let's keep the focus on the search for truth, though, because when Augustine makes the move to Rome, Augustine begins to explore a difference, the key difference in philosophical systems, while he is as well running into more rhetoricians who are really good with their pathos and ethos while maybe not necessarily having the logos behind them. Or, to put it more specifically, Augustine wasn't interested in the logos. Augustine was interested in how people said stuff. And again, he was still fascinated by the beauty of rhetoric, the beauty of language. Not a bad thing. But beauty is also connected to the good. And therefore, in Augustine's continuously reflective mind, the ethos, pathos, and logos connected to this rhetorical activity have to be related to the true in some case. Well, this is where Augustine then runs into members of the Catholic Church, and again, the word Catholic simply means universal. So there's no such thing as a non-Catholic church in the 400s. It's simply the church. The church was referred to as Catholic from the earliest time period because it is the church that is pertaining to the universal church. Well, of course, this is the followers of Jesus. And in this way, Augustine runs into a particularly interesting person, which is the Bishop of Milan, the Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose, while being a saint of the Christian tradition, is also someone who was very, very skilled in rhetoric, someone whom Augustine really enjoyed listening to. Again, the way that Ambrose would say things was very clean, polished, rhetorical. But there's a fun little note at the end of the chapter as Augustine is turning over in his mind the sorts of a search for truth, is that he was uninterested in the content of what Ambrose was saying, because it was the Christian tradition, and when Augustine would read the Bible or would engage with the Bible, it was, as he would say, it was not polished, it was not high class, it was not rhetorically pleasing. But the content is the thing that begins to push back at this notion in Augustine's mind. And again, one of the big question marks that Augustine still has at the end of this chapter is the problem of what exactly the nature of evil is. We touched on this last time, but there was a big part of the later part of this chapter that Augustine highlights the main issue that he's dealing with, which is, again, this physical versus non-physical and the nature of what evil is. This comes to a head when Augustine begins to question what exactly the Christian tradition is saying about the nature of God and the nature of what good and evil is. Because as Augustine is reading in the Christian tradition, God became human. And for Augustine, this is a problem. Because if God became human, then that means that God took on physicality And that means that God, in some ways, was subject to evil, was subject to change, which, again, for someone of classical theism, that's a no-go. God doesn't change. And then how did God become subject to change? But a bigger issue underlying all these things is that if God took on physicality, God became evil? God took a form that was evil? God took a form that was deceptive? Augustine has a problem with this because of the category of physicality versus non-physicality. And Augustine runs into this one of the central things about Christianity is that Christianity does not treat physicality as evil ontologically. Okay? The ontology of the physical world in Christianity is good. This is something that is a very important distinction between the physical reality of the world and the interior will of the creature. Augustine will touch on will later, but again, I'm going to preempt this. It is such a common misconception in modern Christianity that when we look at the nature of the world, because we have the theological tradition, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as Romans chapter 3:23 says, phraseologically. That's not the only thing that sentence says. That sentence begins in Romans 3:21 and ends in 3:24. Let the reader understand what the preacher's trying to tell you. But we have this theological tradition in which we recognize that there is evil in the world. However, I find that the average Christian makes a mistake when we do this. We make a mistake because when we look at the world, we see the world as fallen. Yes, that there is a level at which we, of course, can see that. But however, we misallocate where that fallenness is. We look at humanity in its ontology, its being. We look at humanity in its ontology, and we confuse that with the will that is within humanity. We confuse the physical for the non-physical spiritual essence of humanity, again, which is not necessarily separate. But in the beginning of creation, God created the heavens and the earth and physical humanity as good things. And the volition of humanity is what causes the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Now again, Augustine's going to pick up on this later, but Augustine is struggling with, if we say that the physical reality of humanity is evil, the ontology, what humanity is made out of is evil, then we run into a philosophical problem. Because if Jesus became human, if Jesus took on the physicality of humanity, then does that mean that Jesus became evil? Augustine, again, can't see past this at this moment. But Augustine, again, self-confessedly is saying that I was wrong about this. I was wrong that the ontology of humanity was evil, because this was a holdover from Manichaeism and from Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, still very much alive in the church today. We are so prone to read into the ways in which the scriptures deal with humanity, this Neoplatonist idea of interior non-physical soul is good and the outside physical reality of the body is bad, or non-physical good, physical evil. But this is the exact problem that Augustine runs into in the 400s. Augustine sees the problem with this. And Augustine sees the deep issue even within Scripture about this. Because from his conception in Manichaeism and in Neoplatonism, he sees this as a roadblock to Christianity. Because Christianity says the other thing, that physical reality is good, and that the interior volition of humanity is evil. Again, think about the times in which the Lord says in the Old Testament, the heart and inclinations of humanity was pointed towards evil, not the physical reality of the human. So even in the Bible, there's a distinction between the physical ontology and the spiritual interior volitional idea or appointedness of humanity. There's even a difference there. But Augustine is not ready to make that jump here. What we are interested in, though, is that when Augustine is searching for truth, Augustine runs into this problem head on. And this is where Ambrose of Milan, in his rhetorical polishedness, then begins to slip in the logos. Whereas Faustus had the ethos and the pathos, but then perhaps not the logos, not the actual theory behind the system which he was talking about. Augustine, in meeting Ambrose, sees the ethos and pathos combined with a solid logos. That logos, however, that content was simply a complete departure from his previous philosophical system, and therefore was met with resistance by Augustine, because he's just like, how could it be that God becomes human? Because if he became human, physical reality is evil. Except that Christian tradition does not say that. The search for truth is leading Augustine down these big philosophical questions. But the search for truth, the parsing from illusion and reality, of Augustine being distracted by the shiny rhetorical and not the content underneath. Augustine being attracted to the things that sound good, but maybe not are good. Well, that's beginning to change, because Augustine then starts down the path in this later chapter of thinking carefully about what it means to live well and what it means to live truly. His decision to give a second examination to Christianity. He's not there yet, and he's not going to be there for another little bit. But this taking another look at Christianity, at least the possibility that Christianity has something to offer, and his departure from Manichaeism is one that was underscored by these big philosophical problems. And keep that in mind as we continue on throughout the Confessions. The rest of the chapter is fairly self-explanatory as it comes to his sort of autobiographical information, but keep those big pieces in mind. His struggle with what it means to live a good and true life, and his struggle with the philosophical reality of not everything that is physical is bad. And so the continued journey of Augustine in the Confessions is one that is going to be marked by that, the search for truth, the parsing from illusion and truth, and also the separation from this bifurcated reality of physical and non-physical, and into a holistic reality of how these two realities overlap each other, and how good and evil is not in these two camps, but rather good and evil is constituted in something completely different. Pay attention to that as we move into the ambitions that Augustine has for his particular career and his political ambitions. Because these are questions that don't go away, but questions that heighten as he begins to pursue his secular career in politics, and as he begins to come into contact more and more with Christianity as taught through Ambrose of Milan, and as taught through the church in a way that is completely different from what Augustine expected.